Not so long ago, there was a mysterious murderer stalking New York City at night, methodically killing and cutting up gay men. He brought their mutilated torsos and body parts to this river, the Hudson River, where, concealed in garbage bags, they were dumped into the water. The first torso was discovered in December of 1975, and then, every 3 months after that, there was a new dead man found floating in the river. Every 3 months, for 18 months, remains were recovered, all the way in to the summer of 1977. Despite the chilling repetition and the multiple clues left by what most certainly was a gruesome serial killer, the bag murders were barely reported on by mainstream media. The 6 men were victims of a killer, but also of the times. Nearly everything published about these John Does is in passing, mentioned in relation to another man's death and the person convicted for his murder, Paul Bateson. Bateson made a compelling suspect for the bag murders, but he was never charged, and the 6 men never identified. Was Paul Bateson really their killer, or did he take the heat for another man's crime? A serial killer that escaped capture, one who stalked these sidewalks and then got away with murder? Why was Bateson the only suspect? And what was a renowned film director doing inserting himself into the case? Welcome to New York City and the story of a killer, the story of a maybe serial killer. This is the tale of Paul Bateson and the unsolved bag murders. Paul Bateson is the only named suspect in the case. He's a convicted killer known not only for his crime, but for his brief role in one of the most successful horror films of all time, The Exorcist. Though not an actor, the 32-year-old radio technician was working at the NYU Medical Center when director William Friedkin came in, doing research for his film. Friedkin watched as Bateson, along with his team, performed a cerebral angiogram, and he was immediately impressed by the procedure. At the time, cerebral angiography was performed via a puncture in the neck that would briefly spew blood in rhythm with the patient's heartbeat. When the director saw this dramatic and bloody event, he knew that it was perfect for his movie. He and the film crew returned several months later to shoot a scene in which Linda Blair is examined to determine if there's a medical reason for her bizarre behavior. It's considered to be one of the most memorable and disturbing scenes in the film due to its unsettling realism and the terrifying spray of blood. These days, it's also unsettling to see due to the presence of a convicted killer and possible serial killer interacting with a child on screen. In the scene, Paul Bateson does a majority of the speaking. He talks the young character through the procedure that they're about to perform, warning her that the puncture will hurt and reassuring her as she winces. The director, William Friedkin, later recalled how impressed he was with Paul's bedside manner. He was well known at the hospital for his impeccable demeanor and his ability to calmly explain things to patients. Dr. Lane, the attending physician, called him the best radio tech he had ever worked with. But by the time The Exorcist was released in theaters, Paul Bateson had begun drinking heavily. He had struggled with alcoholism since his time in the Army, and by 1975 it had affected his job performance. He was a stellar employee no longer, and hospital staff decided to let him go. It should be noted that 1975, which marks Paul's descent into alcoholism and the loss of his career, also marks the discovery of the first of the 6 bodies found in the Hudson River. On one hand, this timing seems to support the idea of Paul as the serial killer responsible for the murders. But on the other hand, it marks the end of Paul's access to the NYU Medical Center, their tools, supplies, and plastic bags. Medical examiners believed that the serial killer was either a butcher or a person with medical experience because of the way the cuts were made to the bodies. Recent accounts of this case claim that the bags the does were found in were marked with the words property of NYU Medical Center Neuropsychiatric Unit. However, reporting at the time does not support this claim. If it were true, and if Paul is the bag killer, then it means that he stole the plastic bags from work in advance of his termination and kept them on hand for years in order to dispose of his victims. Also, while police do eventually search Paul's apartment and do uncover evidence used against him in court in a different case, they did not find any plastic bags matching the bags used, nor do they ever find any physical evidence that ties him to any of the bag murder victims. What police did find inside the bags, in addition to the mutilated bodies of 5 white men and 1 black man, was leather clothing worn by the victims. This clothing was traced to several Greenwich Village shops that catered specifically to homosexual clients. Paul admitted that during this time, he spent time in Greenwich Village and had been pursuing relationships with gay men at clubs. "Leather impresses me," he later said to journalist Arthur Bell in a jailhouse interview a few weeks after his arrest. Arthur Bell was a prominent LGBT activist who wrote about gay rights for the Village Voice. At the time, public attitudes towards homosexuality were changing rapidly. Columnist Michael Musto explained to Inside Edition Digital that the 1970s was a sexual revolution for everybody, particularly gay men. This was after the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion, which defined the modern gay movement, and it led to a lot more freedom and visibility. And it was before AIDS reared its ugly head in the early 80s, so sex was everywhere, unquote. There were areas in the city, nightclubs and cafes founded by or for members of the queer community that were safe havens. But violence from homophobia was a major concern. "If you walked down certain streets, you were in danger," said Senator Tom Duane, New York State's first openly gay senator. Relationships between the queer community and police, as well as media, were strained. Arthur Bell wrote in 1977, "Every year there are approximately 4 sexually oriented murders of gay men in the Greenwich Village area. Seldom do the papers report the crimes," unquote. Such was the case when Bell's acquaintance Addison Verrill was found dead in his apartment on the morning of September 14, 1977. Bell knew it needed to be reported on. Addison had been violently attacked, hit on the head with a frying pan, and stabbed in the chest with a 10-inch kitchen knife. But despite the severity of the crime, there had been very little news coverage. Like Bell, 36-year-old Addison Verrill was a gay writer living in New York. At work, he was regarded as a top-notch reporter, a film critic working for Variety. He was best known for his critiques of pornographic films. Described as intelligent and sharp-witted, Mr. Verrill had graduated from Princeton University in 1963 and had spent 3 years in Nigeria with the Peace Corps before returning to the States. He had written a screenplay, was working on a novel, and had spent more than 8 years writing for Variety. Addison's apartment had been trashed, with drawers opened and books shoved off bookcases. Police said that they weren't sure that anything was missing, but were treating the crime as a robbery gone wrong. But Arthur Bell felt that this was incorrect, and he wrote an article criticizing the police's theory, saying, quote, "It was not a break-in crime. Verrill had brought his assailant home or allowed him into the apartment." Bell pled for information and asked anyone who knew anything about the murder to reach out to police. And his request paid off. Just 3 days after the article on Verrill's attack was published, the Village Voice received multiple calls from a man taking credit for the murder. Their city news reporter, Jan Albert, took the first few calls. She told Arthur, quote, "He said last week's front page story was wonderful, but there's a mistake. You called the murderer a psycho, and he says he isn't," unquote. With Arthur's approval, when the man called back a third time, Jan gave the caller Arthur's phone number. Arthur waited by the phone. When finally the stranger called, the man on the other line said that he didn't recognize this picture of Addison that the voice had printed. He told Arthur, quote, "It sure doesn't look like Addison Verrill. I killed Addison." "Oh, then what did Addison look like?" asked Arthur. "Better than that," replied the man. "Who is this?" asked Arthur. "I just told you I killed Addison Verrill. I can't tell you my name," he said. But the man did go on to describe what happened the night of the murder. Over the course of the 20-minute call, he told Arthur Bell about going to the Badlands, a gay bar where he first encountered Addison Verrill. The caller admitted to being an alcoholic, but one who hadn't had a drink in several months. Addison offered to buy him a beer, and over the course of the night allegedly also offered him cocaine, weed, and a variety of other drugs. They left together and went to another bar, the Mine Shaft, before finally arriving at Addison's apartment early in the morning. There, they drank more, consumed more, and had consensual sex. But afterwards, the caller decided that he felt unfulfilled. He wanted more. He wanted a relationship. Addison, however, was uninterested. The man on the phone told Bell, quote, "I can't fathom exactly what I did. I concede that it was my alcoholism. There's a stigma placed on alcoholics. But I needed money, and I hated the rejection. It was the rejection that triggered things. Something flared up in my head. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I took a heavy frying pan from the kitchen and knocked Addison out. Then I went into a drawer in the right-hand side of the kitchen, removed a knife, and stuck it into Addison's chest." Unquote. Bell would later say that the caller spoke about the murder as if recounting the plot of a two-character play in which he and Addison were merely actors. He described ransacking his victim's apartment, stealing $57 in cash, in addition to Addison's passport, MasterCard, and some of his clothing. The man on the other line seemed eager to talk. He told the reporter that he had grown up wanting to be a dancer. He had always been interested in the arts and in the past had been in movies and on TV. Now, he said that he was a married man with a family. His wife in Berlin didn't understand his homosexuality. He expressed some remorse about the murder, but when considering his path forward, said, quote, "There's no way to atone. I'd like to atone, but I don't want to give myself up. I wouldn't be able to practice again. I'd lose my license." "Practice what?" Bell asked. "I can't tell you, Arthur. Then you'd know," he said. When the call finally ended, Arthur Bell went directly to the police department. Lieutenant John Yuckness of New York's 6th Precinct spoke with Bell, and he believed that there was a strong possibility that the caller was Addison Verrill's killer. He had known things only his killer would know, like about the stolen MasterCard and about an unknown white substance police had found at the scene. Crisco, apparently. Lieutenant Yuckness said that Bell's caller was the first tangible evidence he had on the case, and he believed that the person would call again. Police set up a routine patrol of Bell's apartment and gave him a special number to call in case of emergency. Late that night, at 11:30 p.m., Arthur Bell's home phone rang. With nervous anticipation, he picked up the receiver. But this time, it was a different man calling about Addison's murder. "I know who killed Addison Verrill," said the new caller. This man did identify himself, and in his articles, Arthur refers to him by the name Mitch. Mitch said that he had become friends with a man that he had met at St. Vincent's Hospital the previous summer. This man was an alcoholic and an unemployed X-ray technician. Mitch said that he had received a call from this man the morning after Addison's death, and that on the phone he had confessed to the killing. Mitch said, quote, "He had to share his experience with somebody. I was the only person he could relate to," end quote. The killer's name, Mitch said, was Paul Bateson. Mitch had taken this tip to the police, but nothing had come of it. Arthur felt that Mitch's description did match the man that he had spoken with, and so he again reached out to the police, who confirmed that they had spoken with Mitch, but With no arrest record, they had considered Bateson not a strong suspect. However, police did bring Mitch in for an interview and decided to bring Paul Bateson in too. When police arrived at Bateson's apartment, he was apparently drunk and said that he knew exactly why the police were there, for, quote, killing that guy in the village. At the station, he confessed to the murder, although he refused to sign a written transcript of the confession. One detective told Bell that everything Bateson said matched what Bell had been told in the first phone call, which Bateson apparently admitted to making. The detective also said that Bateson led police to Verrill's missing passport and credit card. He was swiftly charged with homicide and taken to the courthouse for arraignment. Bell encountered him on the sidewalk en route and commented that Paul looked as if he and his clothes hadn't seen soap in a month. He appeared tense and frustrated. When voice photographer Fred McDerra took this photo, Bateson yelled, "Who is this guy? Why are they doing this to me?" Not everything said on the phone call matched to reality. The caller had said he was married with a teenage son and a wife in Berlin, but these things are not true for Paul Bateson. Born on August 24, 1940, Paul Bateson grew up in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. He served in the Army and was stationed in Germany in the early 60s, but there's no record that he married or fathered a child there. It was in Germany where he started drinking, out of boredom. When he returned to the States, Paul moved to New York City and engaged in his first long-term relationship with a man. After their relationship ended in 1973, Paul moved to Brooklyn and commuted from there to his job at the New York University Medical Center. At work, he was well-liked and respected by his colleagues. They described him as competent and caring. When sober, Bateson had a knack for setting people at ease with his demeanor and his words. Even after his arrest, Arthur Bell found Bateson alluring, taking time to describe his electric blue eyes. After losing his job at the medical center, Bateson began picking up odd jobs for money. He cleaned apartments in Greenwich Village, worked at a liquor store in Cherry Grove, and took tickets at Big Top, a pornographic film theater. One of Paul's coworkers at Big Top later spoke with Arthur Bell about Paul, calling him warm and loving. But the coworker warned that Paul did everything in excess. He said that Paul would take any pills that he found left in the theater. He also said that Paul's favorite topic of conversation was himself. Bell visited Paul in jail for an interview and wrote, "Perhaps it is inevitable, but as he talks, I find myself attracted to him. He's extraordinarily appealing, interesting in a quiet way, and his revelations are without self-pity. Yet, I am aware that he's playing with me. At the same time, he's confiding in someone whose articles he reads, someone who may be able to help him, but who is partly responsible for his capture. If our roles were reversed, I doubt I'd have anything to do with the reporter. But here he is." In preliminary hearings, Bateson's defense attorney made attempts to suppress his confession from evidence, arguing that his constitutional rights had been violated the night of his arrest. Paul said that the confession had been given while he was drunk and before police read him his rights. Paul also claimed that he had not made any phone calls to Arthur Bell, but had seen his article in the paper. Anything he may have said to police must have simply been in reference to what he had read. However, the judge decided that Bateson's constitutional rights throughout the arrest had been upheld, and he allowed the confession, as well as Arthur Bell's articles, to be used as evidence in court. Paul Bateson went to trial in March of 1979. He testified that Addison Verrill had been alive when he left his apartment at 3:30 a.m. the night of his murder. But Assistant District Attorney William Hoyt brought the jury Addison's passport and credit card, both of which had been found by police in Bateson's apartment. While the trial lasted 4 days, it took jurors only 30 minutes to return their verdict. Paul Bateson was guilty. The following month, during his sentencing, Paul was linked to the 6 bag murders publicly for the first time. District Attorney William Hoyt told Justice Morris Goldman that Paul had bragged about his involvement in additional murders to a witness, Richard Ryan. Hoyt said, quote, "He told Mr. Ryan that killing is easy, that getting rid of the bodies is the hard part. He said that he cut up his victims and put the parts in plastic garbage bags to dispose of them," end quote. Richard Ryan had met Paul Bateson years earlier in rehab and had also testified that Paul had told him about the murder of Addison Verrill. I suspect that he is the person who called Arthur Bell, and who Bell calls Mitch in his article, a rhyme of an alias, Mitch instead of Rich. D.A. Hoyt also said that while there was no direct evidence tying Bateson to the murders, a torso had washed up in the Hudson River every 3 months from December of 1979 until the summer of '77. No new torsos had been found in the 18 months since Bateson's arrest. In response, Paul told the judge, quote, "I still contend that I am not guilty of the crimes, and I am not the person described by Mr. Hoyt at all. I feel a great loss for Mr. Verrill, and I am not at all the type of person as he has described me." Ultimately, Bateson was sentenced to 20 years to life for the murder of Addison Verrill, but Judge Goldman decided that the deaths of the 6 other men were, quote, "too ephemeral and unconnected to the trial." The district attorney told the press that none of the 6 men had been identified, but disclosed that leather clothing found with the victims had been traced to Greenwich Village. Police told a journalist with the Associated Press that even though several gay men from Greenwich Village had been reported missing, there was no way to match any of the torsos to a missing person due to the lack of dental records or fingerprints. There were reportedly no identifying marks found on the remains. Today, we have DNA and genetic genealogy, tools that certainly could solve the mysteries of these men's identities, but only if the evidence still exists. Unfortunately, we know that it does not. Esquire's Matt Miller wrote extensively about Paul Bateson and the bag murders in 2018 and 2019 after an actor playing Bateson appeared in an episode of Netflix's Mindhunter. Miller spoke with a representative of the NYPD who said that finding any record of an unidentified body from the late 70s would be impossible. Back then, police seemed satisfied that Bateson was responsible and did not pursue the case any further, which is just sad. It's hard to believe that nothing remains of the case files for these 6 unnamed men. For many years, the story of the bag murders and the 6 men found floating in the Hudson was largely ignored. Then, in 2012, director William Friedkin brought it back into the public eye. He had a new movie coming out and was planning a theater re-release for The Exorcist's 40th anniversary. So, William Friedkin was interviewed by journalist Michael Guillen. In the interview, Friedkin recalled learning about the accusations against Paul via newspaper headlines. He remembered Paul as the polite and kind radiology tech that he had directed years earlier and was shocked to see these allegations. According to Friedkin, he called Bateson's lawyer and asked to visit Paul at Rikers Island. Friedkin said that Paul was relaxed in jail. He called him cheerful even. He says Paul told him that he remembered killing just one person. Friedkin said, quote, "I asked him if he had murdered these people, and he said, I remember murdering this one guy, Addison Verrill, who was the theater critic for Variety. Bateson picked him up in a place called the Mine Shaft in Lower Manhattan, took him home. They took a lot of drugs, you know the drill, and he wound up hitting him over the head with a frying pan, he remembered, and then cutting him up and putting the parts of Burrell's body in body bags that were found in the East River," end quote. Which is just straight up wrong and not what happened. Addison Verrill was not chopped up and was not put into the East River. The bag murder bodies were not recovered from the East River, but from the Hudson. Additionally, there are issues with Friedkin's timeline. Friedkin says that he talked with Paul while he was still awaiting trial at Rikers Island. However, Paul wasn't publicly linked to the bag murders until after his trial, during his sentencing. When did this interaction take place? Or did it? While a second account of Paul confessing to the bag murders would be significant, all of the inconsistencies and the errors complicate the issue for me rather than clarifying it. Why would the director wait so long to tell this story? More than 30 years had passed. Could he have misremembered or fabricated parts of it? Perhaps. Friedkin has also said that this conversation inspired his film Cruising, which stars Al Pacino playing an undercover police officer investigating a killer who targeted gay men. But production for Cruising started just 3 months after Bateson's sentencing. It doesn't seem that there's near enough time for him to have inspired it. While Friedkin may have taken parts of a true story and fictionalized it for dramatic effect, so much is missing from the real-life story of the bag murders. Who were the 6 victims? There's never any explanation as to where the men's hands or heads, wallets or IDs ended up, or where the killings took place. Whatever Paul told William Friedkin, nothing new was added. It's just another sensational story with no physical evidence to back it up. All of the evidence against Paul for the bag murders is circumstantial. Bateson was convicted for the murder of Addison Verrill, but Addison was stabbed in his home and left there. Why wasn't Addison cut into pieces and dumped into the river? What would make a serial killer change his MO so abruptly? Why lie to Arthur Bell about it being his first kill? So many questions left unanswered and no way to answer them. Paul Bateson served 24 years before he was paroled in 2003. During his time at the Arthur Kill Correctional Facility, Paul practiced Catholicism and was involved in various philanthropic pursuits, such as raising donations and collecting canned goods and other items from the prison store for a veterans homeless shelter in Long Island. After his release, he disappeared from the public eye, living a quiet life until his death in 2012. Was Paul Bateson a serial killer who dumped the remains of 6 men in the Hudson River? I'm pretty certain that we can never know. It seems as though this case will always be one of myths and legends, one that's always going to be up for debate.